Hello, this is Reindeer's Bees, and today I'm going to talk all about pollen patties. So why should you use them, what are they, and when should you use them? So I didn't really use pollen patties my first couple of years. The people in bee class never told me that I needed it, and it's not an absolute necessity, but it's worth the money that you invest into the patties, the effect it has on the bees, if you use them at the right time on the right colonies. So pollen patties, what are they? So pollen patties are like a thick, gooey substance that's just basically a protein substitute for bees. Global patties have real natural pollen in them mixed in. I think it makes a big difference because the bees seem to much prefer the global patties over the other patty. It's a different color too. Also, I think they have pretty different makeup, but if you're going to buy pollen patties, I'd suggest you get the global patties. The bees take them down much better, and I think they just like them more for whatever reason. So what do pollen patties even do? What pollen patties do is they help the hive ramp up their brood rearing, because the most important thing for a colony to decide how much brood they're going to rear is the pollen coming in. So that pollen patty, it allows the bees, it gives them enough protein and just stimulates them to make a lot more brood. And as beekeepers, we want them to make a lot more brood. For our honey crops to split, whatever you may want to do, most people want more brood, not less. So using a pollen patty at the opportune time can lead to that. They can be used in early spring. They also can be pretty effective during like a summer dearth, the dearth being, when there's no nectar or pollen available. So when there's no pollen available during the summer, you can feed them pollen patties. Is this natural pollen? No, not even close. But even though it may not be as good as natural pollen, it really is not as good, it's still valuable. It still allows the bees to rear more brood and stimulates them to rear more brood than they would without the pollen patty. So this is especially helpful if you live in the South and your colony was a split during the honey flow, and they haven't stored a bunch of pollen in the combs in the form of bee bread. So that pollen patty is the way that they're able to rear a lot more brood and, just stimulates them to actually rear more brood. So I use pollen patties in the springtime. That's the main time I use it because our season's so short. We have pollen pretty much from April till, October. So pollen is not really a huge issue around where I live during the summer, but it's still very useful to use a pollen patty in the early spring. So the first pollen has a huge effect on the brood nest with bees. Many studies have been done. Certain breeds react to pollen more substantially than others. Like some rear brood a lot more faster because of the first pollen. But overall, when bees get that first whiff of natural pollen, it's huge. The queen starts going gangbusters, laying eggs everywhere. So if you're able to supplement that pollen after she starts laying, so let's say they have a couple warm days in, let's say, late March here, probably in the low 60s, and the bees go out and they go to the crocuses and the first maples and start having the pollen. The bees will bring that back into the nest. The queen, she doesn't feel the pollen, but through whatever unknown mechanism, to me personally, I'm sure somebody studied this, the queen knows there's a lot of pollen coming in, so therefore she starts to lay a lot more eggs. And when the queen is laying a lot more eggs, the bees let it, develop into larvae. But let's say 3 days of warmth and pollen, then it's cold in 29 degrees and, there's freezing rain coming down. Then the bees aren't able to get out and get back to the pollen. So what often happens is they've grown the brood nest a lot during when the pollen was coming in, but now that the pollen stopped and they don't have, let's just say this colony doesn't have much stored pollen, then they have to start cannibalizing their brood. What they'll do is the youngest brood, so they'll start with the eggs and they'll cannibalize the eggs. They'll eat the eggs for the nutritional value because there's not enough pollen in the nest, and they just keep eating the older, the eggs first and then young larvae and then getting to the older larvae. So they just keep eating brood till the nutritional balance of pollen in the hive is met. So they could cannibalize a lot of that brood. And so you could potentially have lost, 10,000 workers in 3 days that they didn't have any pollen. So what the pollen patty is great at is smoothing over nutritional gaps. Ian Stepler talks about this all the time. He had a video of like 2 days. I'll link it below. About just this thing. It's pollen patties are supposed to, help smooth over the gaps in nutrition. So if they have 3 days where they get a bunch of pollen and then 5 days where they don't, or more or less, whatever, the pollen patty is really important in keeping them, rearing brood. And then the other effect pollen patties have, if you put it on right when the first pollen comes on, it also is just stimulatory. Like they're probably more likely to raise more brood now that they have the pollen patty on rather than when they didn't. So it's not only there to smooth over the nutritional gaps, it also helps stimulate them to rear more brood. And if they have enough honey in the hive, then that's great because you're going to have a lot more bees come springtime. So that's what pollen patties are great at. And if they're used in the right context, they can definitely be worth their money. And on one last side note, you should definitely put the pollen patty directly over the cluster because that's where they're able to eat it, because that's where the brood is. They'll eat a lot more of it. It'll be a lot more useful to the bees if you put it directly over the cluster. And I give about 1/3 of a global patty to most hives. A global patty is, I think, about this long and about this wide and maybe this thick. And I give about 1/3 of a patty to most hives because I don't want to waste my money on pollen patties that they're not going to eat. So I just give them less and then keep feeding them. And the smaller the colony, the less patty they'll eat. So you could give 1/4 to a small colony and, 1/3 or 1/2 to a much bigger colony. That's how I'd suggest you use the pollen patties. I like to, check every 2 weeks after I put them on to make sure they have more patty. Because what's bad is if you put on the patty, they start laying up a bunch of brood. They eat through the patty in, 3 weeks. Then you get another 3 or 4 days in April here in Maine, which is not unusual, where there's bad weather and they can't fly and go get pollen. And then their brood nest is going to shrink again, and probably shrink more drastically because you increased it more drastically by having the patty on. So make sure you replace it about every 2 weeks, depending on how much you put on there. There's a lot of factors, but 2 weeks is my general rule. So I'll replace it about 3 times, and then once a lot of natural pollen starts to come in late April and early May, you don't really need to feed it anymore. But what I find with the global patties is they're more apt to eat it when there's a lot of pollen coming in, whereas with the Man Lake kind of like molassesy patties, they have kind of like a molasses smell. They just completely stop eating it. But with the global patties, they seem to eat longer with when there's more pollen. But you don't need to feed them that. You're just wasting your money at that point if they got plenty of pollen coming in. So I hope this helps. You know when to put on patties and how they should be used or how they can be used. If you're interested in more educational content just like this, go down, hit that bell to be notified when I upload, and subscribe. Comment down below, follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Reindeers Bees, and I will see you in the next one.